The ground had been lying to Eli Calhoun for 30 years, and he never once suspected it. He had walked that barn floor 10,000 times, dragged hay bales across it, knelt on it to set a mare's broken leg, slept on it one bitter February when the house roof caved under snow. He had taken that floor for granted the way a man takes his own heartbeat for granted, never imagining it could stop, never imagining it was hiding something beneath every single step he had ever taken. But on the morning of October the 4th, in the year of our Lord 1871, the ground finally stopped lying. A board gave way under Eli's left boot with a sound like a gunshot, and the dark rushed up at him from below like something that had been waiting a very long time to be let out. Eli Calhoun was 44 years old, lean as a strip of dried jerky, with calloused hands that had known a plow and a fence post and a shovel handle more than they had ever known comfort. His hair was the color of field straw going gray at the temples, cut rough and uneven by his own hand with shears he also used on the horses. His eyes were pale blue, the kind of pale that looked almost white in certain light, and they sat deep under a shelf of brow that gave his face a perpetual expression of quiet deliberation, as though he were always thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead of whatever trouble was coming. He wore a work shirt so faded it had gone from whatever color it had once been to a kind of universal washed-out brown, suspenders, and denim trousers with a patch on the left knee that his wife Margaret had sewn before she died. He wore her patch every day. It was the closest thing he had to religion. He was not a man who startled easily. He had seen drought and flood, and the years in between that were somehow worse because they offered just enough hope to keep you going before they took it back. He had buried a wife and a son and a daughter, all in the same hard Dakota Territory ground, all in the same 5 years that had turned his hair from straw to frost. He had watched neighbors pack up and leave, watched banks foreclose, watched the land claim everyone it could. And he had stayed, not out of stubbornness, or not entirely, but because this was his ground, and leaving it felt like admitting that all those people in it had died for nothing. So when his boot went through the barn floor and he found himself staring down into a hole that opened onto absolute darkness, Eli Calhoun did not cry out. He caught himself on the stall post, steadied his breathing, and looked down. The hole was roughly 2 feet across. The edges of the broken board were old, not the gray old of weathered wood, but the black old of wood that had been in close contact with earth for a very long time. Below, the darkness was complete. No glimmer, no reflection. Just black, the way black gets when it has had a long time to settle. He stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing came up from the dark. No animal smell, no water smell, no rot. Just cold air, moving very slightly, like a slow breath. Eli let go of the stall post and stood straight. He looked around the barn as though expecting someone to be watching him, though he had not had a hired hand in 2 years and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles east. There was no one. Just his 2 remaining horses in their stalls, a big roan named General and a short-tempered sorrel mare he called Agnes, and the chickens that had colonized the hayloft and would not be persuaded to leave. Agnes tossed her head and showed him the white of one eye. She did not like the hole either. "Easy," Eli said to her. Then to himself, quietly, "Well, I'll be." He got a lantern from the hook near the barn door, lit it, and came back to the hole. The lantern light fell into the dark and was swallowed for a moment before it found something to rest on. Earth walls. A floor of packed clay, maybe 6 feet down. And leading away from directly beneath the hole, heading north, heading toward the low hills that rose behind the property, a passage, a tunnel. Man-made, clearly, though made by hands that had not used lumber or stone. The walls were reinforced with woven branches and packed earth in a way that had preserved them remarkably well, the interlaced wood still holding, the clay still tight. It was not wide. A man of Eli's frame would have to go through on hands and knees or hunched very low, but it was clearly intentional. Built for purpose, built to last, and built a very long time ago. Eli held the lantern over the hole and looked north along the tunnel until the light failed and the passage bent slightly to the right and disappeared. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he went back to the house, ate breakfast standing up because he always ate standing up when he was thinking hard, drank 2 cups of bitter coffee, and made a decision. He was going in. If you want to see more stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and there's plenty more where this came from. The first thing Eli did was reinforce the hole. Not out of fear, or not exactly, but out of the habit of a man who had survived 44 Dakota winters by always shoring up what was weak before it got weaker. He pulled back the boards surrounding the break, 3 of them lifted with almost no effort, their nails having long since rusted loose from whatever they had been anchored to, and found that beneath them, the earth had been deliberately hollowed. Not just the hole itself, but a rough chamber, maybe 4 feet across and 4 feet deep, like an antechamber or a landing before the tunnel proper began heading north. Whoever had dug this had done it right. They had started with a drop point, a place to lower yourself down comfortably before committing to the crawl. He rigged a rope from a ceiling beam, tied it off, and lowered himself down. The cold hit him immediately. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of deep earth, which is a different thing entirely. The cold of places where the sun has never reached and never will. He held the lantern high and turned slowly. The chamber walls were smooth, not just packed, smoothed deliberately by tools or hands. And there were marks in the clay. Eli brought the lantern close. The marks were not random. They ran in horizontal bands around the chamber walls, about chest height on a man who would have been standing upright, so chest height on a short man, or on someone who expected to be coming through here on a regular basis. The marks were geometric, triangles nested inside triangles, lines radiating out from central points, interlocking diamond shapes, and, at intervals, what appeared to be the outline of an animal, though the lantern light made the shapes dance and shift in ways that made detail hard to pin down. A buffalo, possibly, or a horse, or something Eli could not identify, something with a long neck and too many legs. He was not a man of great learning, but he was not ignorant either. Margaret had been the reader in the house, but she had read aloud, and Eli had listened, and in 30 years of listening, he had absorbed a good deal more than he sometimes let on. He knew enough about the Sioux, the Lakota specifically, since this was their country and had been long before it was anyone else's, to recognize that these marks had the quality of ceremony about them. Not decoration, something more deliberate than decoration, something that was meant to do a thing, not just be a thing. He stood in that cold chamber for longer than was probably sensible, holding his lantern and looking at those marks, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt small. Not in a bad way, not the smallness of defeat, but the smallness of standing next to something very old, something that had been here before him and would go on after him, and recognizing his own place in that scale. It was humbling without being humiliating, and it was so unfamiliar a feeling that for a moment he could not name it. Then he turned north and started into the tunnel. The tunnel went on for longer than it had any right to. Eli had assumed, without really examining the assumption, that it would be short. A storage cache maybe, or a hiding place. The Lakota had every reason to have hiding places on land that had been, within living memory, thoroughly and violently taken from them. Something to stash goods, or a person, during the worst of it. Something that could be closed up and left. But the tunnel did not end at 50 feet, or 100, or what felt like 200. The passage bent gradually right, then left, then right again, in long, gentle curves that kept him consistently oriented roughly northward, even as they prevented him from seeing more than 20 feet ahead. The floor was smooth, and the ceiling was just high enough that he could move in a low crouch rather than a full crawl, which was a mercy for his knees. The woven branch reinforcement continued throughout, though in places it had collapsed inward, and he had to push through tangles of old dried wood that crumbled at the touch, showering him with decades of dust. In other places, the walls were as solid as the day they had been made. He had been in the tunnel for what he judged was about 30 minutes when he found the first marker. It was a stake, buried upright in the floor of the tunnel, with a bundle of what had once been feathers tied near the top by a length of cord. The feathers were mostly dust and quill now, but a few had survived, and they were, or had been, red. The stake itself was carved, though the carving was too small and too worn for Eli to make much of it in the lantern light. He crouched beside it for a while, not touching it, just looking. He had heard stories. Everyone in the territory had heard stories about the things you were not supposed to touch. Whether those stories came from actual Lakota belief or from the garbled, half-feared mythology that white settlers had constructed out of ignorance and unease, he could not always say. But the stake had the quality of a warning or a marker, and Eli Calhoun had lived long enough to know that when something was put there to be noticed, it was generally worth the trouble of noticing it. He went around it carefully, though the passage barely allowed for it, and kept moving north. The tunnel changed after the marker. The ceiling lifted another foot, which allowed him to stand almost upright, and the walls grew wider by several inches. The branch weaving became more elaborate, more densely interlocked, and in places incorporated what appeared to be painted images worked onto pieces of hide that had been pressed into the clay and sealed over with a thin layer of some kind of protective coating, grease perhaps, or clay mixed with something. The images on the hide were similar in style to the marks in the entry chamber, but more detailed, more complex. They told something, Eli was increasingly certain. They told a story, or made a record, or issued a command. He could not read them, but he could feel their intention, which was something. Another 50 yards. Another marker, this one with blue remnants on the feathers. Another 50 yards. Then the tunnel ended, or rather, it opened. The opening was low and narrow. Eli had to turn sideways and bend nearly double to get through it, and it brought him out into a natural chamber that stopped him so completely that he stood still for a full 10 seconds with the lantern hanging from his hand, unable to move or speak or think. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with walls of stone rather than clay, natural stone, the pale limestone of the region, worn smooth in places and rough in others. The ceiling rose to a point maybe 15 feet above the floor, and near the top of that point, there was a crack in the rock, thin as a knife blade, through which, impossibly, given the distance from any light source Eli could have named, a thread of daylight fell. Just a thread. Just enough to tell him that the world above still existed. But the daylight was not what stopped him. The floor of the chamber was laid with flat stones, carefully fitted, covering an area about 12 feet across in the center of the space. Around the edges, where the stone walls met the floor, the earth had been cleared and packed, and there were objects arranged along the perimeter with a precision that was clearly deliberate. Bundles, some of them. Bundles of what might have been sage or sweetgrass, or something else entirely, long dried to gray. Pottery, some of it intact, painted in red and black with geometric patterns. Carved objects in bone and stone, their purpose obscure, but their craftsmanship evident even after what Eli calculated must have been many decades of undisturbed sitting. And in the center of the laid stone floor, rising perhaps 3 feet from the ground, was a structure. It was made of stone, but not limestone. The stone was dark, almost black, and had a quality to it that the surrounding pale rock did not share. It was smooth in a way that smooth limestone was not smooth, smooth in the way that worked metal is smooth, shaped by intention and friction over a very long time. The structure itself was roughly conical, wider at the base and narrowing upward, and its surface was covered in the same kind of interlocking geometric marks Eli had been seeing since the entry chamber, but here finer, more precise, arranged in spiraling bands that rose from the base to the apex in a sequence that had the unmistakable quality of language. Eli stood at the tunnel opening and looked at this thing for a long, long time. His lantern light moved across it, and in moving across it, he began to notice things he had not noticed in the first shocked moment of seeing. The surface of the dark stone, for instance, was not entirely uniform. There were spots where the stone seemed to be. He could not have explained this to anyone, but this is what it seemed like, more present than the surrounding stone, more dense. as though certain points on that carved surface were pulling at the light rather than merely reflecting it. He was not a superstitious man. He had made it a point in his 44 years to not be a superstitious man, because superstition had killed more people on the frontier than rattlesnakes had, and that was saying something. If you got spooked by every shadow and every story, you ended up shooting at things that weren't there, or sitting still when you should have been moving, or moving when you should have been still. Eli Calhoun had survived by being practical, by asking what a thing was before deciding what it meant. So he walked forward across the fitted stone floor of the chamber, and he stood directly in front of the dark stone structure, and he held his lantern up close, and he looked. And then he saw what it was, and he took 3 steps backward and sat down hard on the stone floor. There was a hand resting on the far side of the structure. Not a skeleton hand, not a carved hand, a hand. A human hand, brown and still and dry as old wood, but intact. The kind of preservation that came from extreme cold or extreme dryness, or both. The kind that occasionally produced, in old mines or cave systems, remains that had outlasted every reasonable expectation. The hand lay palm up on the stone at the base of the structure's far side, fingers loosely curled, the way a sleeping person's hand falls open. Eli got up slowly, went around the structure to the right, and saw what was attached to the hand. A man, an old man, sitting upright against the base of the dark stone structure, with his back straight and his hands at his sides. One visible from the entrance side, now that Eli looked, the other the hand he had first seen, and his eyes closed. He was dressed in garments that had survived the same way the rest of him had survived, through cold and dry and time, and those garments told a long story in their beating and their construction and their colors, even faded as the colors now were. He wore a necklace of carved stone and what appeared to be copper, and at his belt there hung a pouch that had stiffened to the consistency of wood, but was clearly very old and very carefully made. The man's face was deeply lined, deeply old. He had the face of someone who had been very old when this happened, whatever this was, and whatever it meant. Eli crouched in front of him and looked, for a long time, at that face. He had seen death in many forms. He had laid out his wife's body with his own hands. He had held his son while the boy died of fever in a night that felt like it would never end. He had shot men and been shot at and watched men die by accident and by intention and by the slow grinding work of the territory. He knew what death looked like. This was death, but it was not only death. There was something in the arrangement of this man, in the deliberateness of his posture, in the careful placement of the objects around him, in the fact that he was here at all, at the end of this impossibly long and impossibly well-made tunnel, in a chamber that had been prepared for him with great care, that communicated intention. Choice. This man had not been brought here. He had come here, himself, on his own feet, at the end of his life, and he had sat down against this stone with its spiraling marks, and he had opened his hands, and he had waited. Eli sat down on the stone floor across from the old man and set his lantern between them. "Reckon you didn't expect company," he said, after a while. The lantern flame flickered in the slow breath of moving air. "My name is Eli Calhoun," he said. "I own the land above, or the bank says I do, which ain't quite the same thing." He paused. "I don't know your name. I don't know your people, not well enough. I expect you had a long one though. Name and life both." He sat there in the cold underground quiet and thought about what he was going to do. His first thought, and he was not proud of it, was the bank. The bank held his note for $340, which was the sum remaining from a loan he had taken 4 years ago to rebuild after the fire that had taken his barn, the original barn, not this one, and half his outbuildings. He had been paying it down slowly, but slowly was not fast enough, and the bank's man, a fellow named Terrence Hobart, who wore a suit that was a little too fine for the territory, and had the manners of someone who had never once done actual work, had been out twice in the past year to inform Eli that the bank was reviewing his account, which was Hobart's way of saying that the bank was considering whether to take the property. $340. He looked at the pottery along the chamber walls, at the beadwork on the old man's garments, at the stone necklace, at the pouch. He could see how a man could think about those things and $340 in the same breath. He could see how a man could let the arithmetic happen in his head, quietly, without quite intending it. The kind of arithmetic the territory encouraged, the kind that had produced a great many graves and a great many fortunes and not much in between. Eli sat with that arithmetic for a moment, let it run its course. Then he put it away. He put it away the way he had put away other things over the years, the way a man has to put away certain options in order to remain the kind of man he intends to be. It was not righteousness, exactly. It was more like self-preservation of a different kind. The preservation of the part of himself that he could still look at directly when he lay awake at 3 in the morning and the dark of the bedroom pressed down on him and there was nothing to hide behind. He was not going to take anything from this chamber. The question was what he was going to do instead. He went back to the surface. The rope was where he had left it. He climbed out, stood in the barn in the afternoon light. He had been underground for the better part of 3 hours, though it had not felt that long, and stood there brushing clay dust off his shirt while Agnes watched him with her suspicious eye. "I know," he said to her. He went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and thought for the rest of the afternoon. What he knew, or thought he knew, the tunnel was old. The chamber was old. The old man was very old, though the preservation made it impossible to guess with any precision. The whole construction, the entry chamber with its marks, the tunnel with its markers, the chamber with its deliberate arrangements and its dark stone structure, had the quality of something sacred. Not in the vague, catch-all way people use that word when they meant merely unusual or impressive. In the specific, intentional way. This was a place that had been built and maintained and used for something that the people who built and maintained and used it considered of the highest importance. A place of ceremony, of transmission, of whatever the marks on the dark stone were meant to say or hold or be. And it was under his barn, which meant it was under his land, according to the papers he held, but which had been under this land long before his papers existed, and would be under this land long after his papers turned to dust. He thought about the neighbors he might tell. There was McAllister 4 miles east, and the Hendersons to the south, and the Beaumont family that had come out from Ohio 2 years back and settled the section along the creek. Good people, most of them, or decent enough, but he could not think of any of them without seeing simultaneously the arithmetic happening in their heads. Could not think of a one of them who wouldn't, with the best of intentions and the ordinary calculations of frontier survival, start thinking about value, about what things were worth, about who might pay for what. He thought about the army. The army had a presence in the territory, forts and patrols and the occasional surveying party. He thought about what the army tended to do with Lakota sacred sites when it came across them. He stopped thinking about the army. He thought about the Bureau of Indian Affairs and stopped thinking about that too. He thought then about something different, about whether there was anyone who ought to know about this who was not going to immediately begin the arithmetic, about whether there was a right way to do this that was also a survivable way, given that he had $340 of debt and a bank that was reviewing his account. He was still thinking about it when the sun went down. It was 3 days later that Walks with Stones came. Eli was out in the field, the east field, which he was trying to prepare for a late planting, the soil grudging and dry and resistant to the plow. When he looked up and saw a man standing at the edge of his property, at the fence line, watching him. The man was Lakota. Eli was certain of that, though he wore a mixture of traditional dress and what appeared to be a practical working shirt of the kind available at any general store in the territory. He was perhaps 60, perhaps older, with a face that had weathered every season the territory had produced and came out looking like it was made of something stronger than ordinary skin. He was not tall, but he was very still, and stillness of that particular quality, the kind that comes from long practice rather than from uncertainty, made him seem larger than his dimensions. He stood at the fence and did not cross it. He just watched. Eli stopped the plow and walked to the fence line and stopped on his side of it. They looked at each other for a moment. "Eli Calhoun," Eli said. "I know who you are," the man said. His English was precise, with a deliberateness that suggested it was not his first language, but that he had given it considerable attention. "I am called Walks with Stones by my people. You can call me that too if you wish." "All right," Eli said. "What brings you to my fence, Mr. Walks with Stones?" The man looked at him steadily. "You found something under your barn." It was not a question. Eli held the man's gaze. "What makes you say that?" "Because it was time for it to be found," Walks with Stones said simply. "We have been watching this land for many years, waiting. When the ground is ready, it lets certain things come up. I believe the ground decided it was ready 3 days ago. There are things this territory takes from a man, and things it gives back, and the giving back generally happens in ways that the man in question didn't see coming." Eli Calhoun had expected to lose this land. The bank, the drought, the slow grinding arithmetic of a hard place. He had expected them to finish what they'd started. He had not expected the ground under his barn to have other plans. He thought about that sometimes, in the long evenings, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and watching the light go out of the sky over the northern ridge. He thought about thunder before rain, who had walked into the earth 81 years ago with nothing but intention and patience, and had arranged, from underground, for a man he would never meet to keep a secret that mattered. He thought about Walks with Stones crossing that fence line with the calm dignity of someone delivering on a debt owed across generations. He thought about how long things took, when they were being done right. The barn door was closed. The boards were solid. Below them, the tunnel waited in the dark. The chamber waited. The stone waited. Its spiraling marks patient as stars, holding everything it had ever been given to hold. The way the land does, sometimes, for the things it decides are worth keeping. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to the channel. Stories like this one are what we do here. History, mystery, and the voices the ground keeps for us when we forget to listen. We will see you at the next one.